Today we're going to talk about ADHD and a potential measure for us to quantify physical symptoms that may be manifesting in either your or your child's body. Now, ADHD can be overwhelming, and oftentimes we're led with medication as the only option. And this video is to show you other alternative options and ways to understand ADHD beyond just a diagnosis, especially a blanket diagnosis, and beyond just medication as your only option for support. And so there are a lot of different alternative ways that we can continue to support somebody with ADHD. And it's also important to understand how ADHD manifests itself in the body as well as the brain. And so oftentimes when we talk about ADHD, we think about that medication, especially stimulants, are what's prescribed. But that is not the only type of ADHD. And so let's look into some stats regarding ADHD. And this is really, truly eye-opening. And so data shows that ADHD affects 6 million children in the United States alone, and that it's roughly 9.4% of children have been diagnosed. Now, what's really striking is this diagnosis rate has increased by 42% from 2003 to 2011. And that's really staggering, 43% increase from 2003 to 2011. And that's not even saying how much we've increased from 2011 to now, because this is able to just looking back at the data, but how much has it continued to increase? And that's what's really the most alarming stat, because most of these children are being prescribed medication as the first line of treatment. And instead of really understanding what are some of the things they need support on and what are some integrative ways to support them. And so the good news is that here at Sunlife Chiropractic, we're able to see kiddos and adults alike and understand how to support their body and support potentially some ADHD symptoms in addition to treatments they're experiencing outside of our office. So, like we said, oftentimes medication that's prescribed is a stimulant. Now, that's great if you have the type of ADHD that responds well to a stimulant. However, there are different types. So there's a combined type, there's a hyperactive impulsive type, there's an inattentive type, and each different type really requires a different tailored approach and a customized approach. I actually have a ton of respect for Amen Clinics, who does brain scans to look at what areas of the brain are lighting up or engaging or too active, and that it really gives us a ton of insight into what's called limbic ADHD or inattentive ADHD, etc. It gives us really an idea on what areas of the brain are overactive, which ones are underactive, and how can we support that? What symptoms do we expect to see? Because some may lead to more physically hyperactivity, or some may lead to more mental hyperactivity, and some may even lead to symptoms with anxiety and depression. And how really ultimately it all comes back to what's actually happening in the brain. And so that's why when we just blanket treat with a stimulant as, oh, ADHD, here's the treatment, it really is only the right treatment for a subsection. And so we really want to explore deeper what's going on in the symptoms that the child or yourself is experiencing. And I say or yourself because there's a massive amount of, especially adult women right now, that are recognizing that they were overlooked with the diagnostic criteria from when they were kids. Because oftentimes the physical hyperactivity skewed more male dominant, and girls who were able to fly under the radar, maybe just trying to do well in school, saw some of the symptoms pop up and maybe potentially more academic performance or ability to stay focused in class, etc., versus the physical hyperactivity, and may have gone overlooked or undiagnosed by the system. And so really there's adults that are saying, hey, I resonate with these. And really ultimately having ADHD or an ADHD brain is really not a disorder, and we shouldn't look at it as a disorder. It's a different way that the brain is processing and thinking, but with the right tools, that can be extremely beneficial. In fact, there's even people that say your chances of being an entrepreneur are higher if you have ADHD, because it allows your brain the creativity to think outside the box. And so it's not something that we should even view as a negative. It's just something in saying, okay, how does my brain work, and how can I optimize what I'm doing to support my brain, or even my lifestyle or my routines to support what my brain needs? And that's really ultimately, like, even when we talk about the traditional school system, is we're expecting kids to stay still in class for 8 hours, and then we're wondering why they can't just sit still and follow along. And really ultimately, there's strengths and weaknesses and all sorts of kiddos. And so saying, okay, well, just because you can't sit still in class doesn't mean there's necessarily, that's a bad thing, but maybe a hybrid school would work better for you, or a homeschool would work better with a co-op and more time to play outdoors, etc. And so it's really just saying, let's understand our kids and ourselves and our brains, and saying, how can we best tailor our lifestyles and give ourselves support to really reach that potential? So in kids, one of the biggest questions I get asked is, how can my child be stressed? Where is my child experiencing stress? Especially because as adults, we're very familiar with stress in the sense of work stress or family stress, and the mental and emotional stress that is. But how are kids experiencing stress? And so the ways kids experience stress is physically. In school-age kids, that slips, falls, accidents, playing on the playground, moving, posture, etc. Posture, which would be a lot of times tech neck, which is having a tablet where their neck is going forward, or posture in the classroom, and then running on the playground, slipping, falling, etc. And that is also important for brain development, besides for the tech neck. The tech neck we can work to avoid by technology placement and just simple ergonomics. But the slipping and falling on the playground is very important. It's very important for the brain to learn what is safe and what is not safe, and to learn, oh, this is dangerous, and also challenging it for hard things, and how the specific part of the brain only develops when we're exposed to hard things. So that's something, the physical stress, we actually want to make sure we're positively stressing ourselves physically, which would be through positive things like exercise, versus negative things like bad posture. But over time, physical stress puts a demand on the body. The next thing we have is mental and emotional stress. And kids do experience mental and emotional stress, but they also experience mental and emotional stress from the parent. And so the parent's ability to regulate does impact the kid's ability to regulate. And so this can be mental and emotional stress if they're experiencing difficulties with ADHD. This may be mentally and emotionally them struggling, or the frustration they're experiencing, maybe when they're in school, or frustration with peers, etc. But then the parental and mental and emotional stress is directly related to kids. And so it's very important that parents are equally as mindful of regulating their nervous system and their body, especially once we start working to regulate child's nervous system. And so we have mental and emotional stress. And the last thing we have is environmental stress. Now, environmental stress is anything we're exposed to in the environment that we put inside our body that our body has to filter. Now, our body is designed to filter. It's designed to do that with our liver, our kidneys, our skin. And so there's all sorts of ways that we're filtering out and detoxing. But how high is that toxic load is what is an increase in environmental or toxic stress. And right now, one of the biggest things we see for toxic stress is food and the importance of whole food and real food versus processed foods that are oftentimes very small percentage real food. And also different medications or chronic use of antibiotics and how that does impact things like the gut. We know the gut's directly related to the immune system and the gut-brain axis, etc. So we know that these things we put into our body, when even sometimes they are there to serve a purpose, even processed food serves a purpose to decrease hunger in the world, to be able to provide low-cost food options. But on the flip side, we're malnourished because we're not eating real food. And same thing with medication or antibiotics. Antibiotics are there to serve a purpose. If you have strep throat, you're happy that antibiotics exist. But if your child has recurrent ear infections and they're on recurrent antibiotics, it's doing a lot of damage to the gut microbiome that then has to recover. And it can recover. It's definitely a load or a stressor on the body. And so those are how our children experience stress. And so we know that how early they're exposed to these things, how often they're exposed to these things, quantifies their stress load. And so that's one of the things, and we can see that in babies who are colicky or fussy or have reflux, or have a lot of tension in their head and their neck from even potentially birth interventions, or torticollis or head shape, these things that have maybe popped up when they were young, and then how those things are then impacting them as they continue to get older, and how they manifest in different ways as they continue to get older. Especially, like I was saying, even the chronic ear infections or chronic respiratory infections, those are directly related to stress on the nervous system, and especially when our body is in stress, it's going to make us immunocompromised, and so we're going to be more susceptible to getting sick. So frequent ear infections, frequent sinus infections, respiratory infections, etc., put us in a stress state, because being sick is stress, and then the more stressed we are, the more susceptible we are to continue to get sick. And so that's an indicator if your child had colic or reflux or frequent ear infections or sinus infections or respiratory infections. It's a sign that their body may be stuck in this stress response. And so when we see the body is stuck in this stress response, what we mean by that is we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest. We call the sympathetic nervous system, or fight or flight, we call that the gas pedal, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest, digest, restore, regulate, is called the brake pedal. And so when I'm talking about these recurrent stressors, I'm talking about that pushing the gas pedal. And so how early, how often, how much are we pushing the gas pedal? And also, how early, how often, how much are we pushing the brake pedal? Because both are very important. We want to push, and like I said, there's positive stress. It is positive to exercise. However, you have to rest and recover after exercise for the body to restore itself, and also to get stronger. That actually we get stronger in the rest, which is really, really neat to just think how the body works and how we constantly have this intricate balance. So what happens is when the nervous system gets overtaxed or overstressed, which just means we're constantly pushing the gas pedal and we're not balancing it out with the brake pedal, that sends the body into this protection mode or survival mode known as fight or flight. And what's interesting about that is when the brain is in fight or flight, it's going to be focused on survival. Survival is the part of the brain that's the amygdala, and that's based in emotion. And so we're going to make decisions based out of emotion. Versus the cerebrum, which is the motor center, is when there's dysregulation. That's when kids can't sit still. Or the midbrain, which is the limbic system, specifically the hippocampus, that impacts the focus and attention. And then there's also the prefrontal cortex, which is socialization, situational awareness, and the ability to calm and regulate. And so these are the areas that can be downregulated when the amygdala or the stress response is overregulated or overstimulated. And actually, a side note, what's really neat about chiropractic is there's actually research that showed that chiropractic actually stimulated the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the area that affects socialization, situational awareness, and the ability to self-calm and regulate. And so it actually showed that we could light up the prefrontal cortex, which in turn would downregulate that amygdala. And so it's showing that we can shift into this regulating and calming out of this survival or this emotional based center. And so we want to see how overactive is the brain and in what areas. And that's when I was talking about the brain scans are really fascinating too, because you can see this on a scan. You can see, okay, what areas are these are overactive or underactive. And really the idea that when we're constantly stuck in stress, we're going to be moving from emotion or survival. And that's fascinating beyond just kids, but really adults too. And when we interact with each other and somebody is either quick to respond or quick to emotionally get triggered, it's the fact that whenever somebody perceives us as threatening their safety or security, then we trigger that emotional response, and that's what a trigger really is. But it's the fact that so many of us are so stressed or so stuck on this gas pedal that it's hard for us to regulate. And so we can be easily angered or responsive or reactive. And all of those are saying that our brain is moving from the amygdala or the emotion versus the prefrontal cortex and really regulating and logic and decision. And so that's what's so interesting. But honestly, it's not just happening in the brain. So hyperactivity is not just happening in the brain, it's also happening in the body. And so when the body or the brain has been in this gas pedal or sympathetic dominance, what do we see as chiropractors? What do we see physically in the body? Because an overwhelmed brain can really create a lot of demand on the body in two ways. And so we can see that an overwhelmed brain then causes too much tension in the body, which we see on scans. So at our office, we do neurological scans. One of the things we scan is muscle energy or muscle activity. When we scan that, we're looking for a quantifiable number, which is called a total energy, which says how much energy is your body using to maintain posture. And when we scan kiddos who are hyperactive or have been diagnosed with ADHD or have symptoms or behavioral symptoms that may suggest something like that, we can see two things. We see a high total energy, which can be 350 and above when we should be at 150 or below. And that means the body is there's a lot of energy the body is using to maintain posture. And if you can imagine, it's that constant storing of energy. And we see that, and that's called the raging bull. That's when they're hyperactive, we're moving, crashing into things, maybe have balance and coordination issues, because there's so much energy the body has to get out. It's also really tight muscles because of that. And so there's constantly so much energy the body is using. And that really eventually, over time, leads to what's called the drunken bull or the exhausted system. And so sympathetic dominance in its short term is too much energy. In its long term, it's burnout and exhaustion. And that's when we see on the total energy, we see 100 or below when we should be at 150 because we see fatigue in the system. And this is when traditionally, if you were basing things off of behavioral symptoms, they may not be indicators. There may not be indicators for ADHD because we're not seeing the typical hyperactivity, but their body has just experienced so much stress over time that they're worn out. And that as we go in with chiropractic adjustments, we're actually able to turn those muscles back on and we start seeing that energy come back on. And that's really neat because we get to take them out of that sympathetic dominance, out of that exhaustion, and back into a place to move, to learn and grow and develop. And so that's what's so interesting. We get to see when we get to see how is the body doing, and we get to say realistically, how can we see, you can do the brain scans with Amen, but when we're not just moving off behavioral symptoms, let's measure, let's see how much tension do we have in the body. And really, what's happening beneath the hood? How can we look truly for root causes versus giving a blanket diagnosis or a blanket treatment, and say, how can we truly create a customized plan for you or for your child to manage the symptoms that they uniquely are experiencing, and that their experience is different than just, the next person's experience. And so they should be treated with a unique treatment. And so let us look and see how much energy that your child has in their body or yourself, and give you a customized care plan. The last note I'm going to end on is oftentimes we can think that when we think of things that are, quote, disorders, we think of genetics and say, well, what role does genetics play a role? And Bruce Lipton, who is a biologist and an epigenetic and studies epigenetics, showed that it really is only 15% of our genetic code that impacts really outcomes. And so really at that point, 85% is up to us. And so this is so encouraging because it just goes to show, with the proper support, the proper treatment, and the proper understanding, we can really actually unlock an amazing aspect of you or your child's brain, and it can be properly managed so that we can unlock and access incredible creativity, productivity, and success. And so let us take a look and see how you or your child's body is functioning and support you on your journey.